Welcome to part 3 of the How to Start a Podcast video series. In the first 2 parts, we covered the equipment and software required to get started, how to record and edit your podcast episode, and now in this final part, we are actually talking about how to get your podcast uploaded to your host and pushed out to all the various podcast directories like Apple, Google, and Spotify. So you're not going to want to go anywhere. Now, when it comes to pushing your podcast out into the world, you're going to need a podcast host. This is going to be very similar to website hosting. This is going to be the place where your podcast episodes actually live, and your host is going to be what pushes the episodes out to the various podcast directories. I personally recommend you go with Buzzsprout. That is the podcast host that I currently use. And the reason I recommend Buzzsprout is because they're relatively cheap and it is super easy to get started. As far as pricing goes, you can get started on Buzzsprout for free, and that will actually allow you to upload 2 hours of audio content to Buzzsprout. The catch with the free account is that content will only be hosted on Buzzsprout for 90 days with that free account. At that point, you either have to upgrade to a paid account or ultimately switch to a different host. I am currently signed up for that first tier at $12 a month, and that actually allows you to upload 3 hours worth of video content. If you do decide to go with a paid plan and you run out of time that you're paying for, you can actually purchase additional hours for $4 per hour. So it's relatively cheap and it is super easy to do. So let's dive into Buzzsprout and show you how to get started. We come over here to Buzzsprout and we're actually going to click Get Started for Free. And here we'll enter in our information. So I've already went ahead and I made a test podcast here. You can see it's called Nick's Podcast. And before we actually upload the episode, we're going to come over into the podcast settings. Here is where you're going to pick the title of your podcast and your podcast description. I would definitely be very thoughtful and careful about the information that you're putting in these next steps. The information in these steps helps make your podcast more discoverable on apps like Apple and Google and Spotify. So the information you put here is very important. If you need help getting any of this started, I actually have a free guide, the Podcast Quick Start Guide, that I will put a link to in the description of this video. In that Quick Start Guide, there's also a plan where I help you take your podcast from zero to launch in 6 weeks. So if you're interested in getting the Podcast Quick Start Guide, make sure you go check out the link in the description. Now, after you've got your title and your description done, we're going to choose the artwork. If you already have your artwork created, you can upload it here. Now, if you're not much of a graphic designer, there are a lot of places out there like Fiverr and Upwork and 99 Designs that can help you put together a really nice looking cover art for your podcast. You do want to keep in mind that the cover art of your podcast is going to a lot of times be the first thing that people see about your podcast. So you do want to make it attention grabbing and you do want to make it very attractive. Once you have your artwork uploaded, we're going to come down and we're going to pick a category for Apple Podcasts. One thing to keep in mind with your categories, the first category in here is going to be the main category that your podcast is listed to. So whatever you make this one, that is where your podcast will show up. You can choose up to 3 categories for your podcast. I recommend using all 3 of them. It'll just help your podcast be a little bit more discoverable. One thing to keep in mind is you can come back and change this information at any time. So don't feel like this decision is the decision that's going to make or break your podcast. If for whatever reason you want to come back later and change them, you can always do that. So once we have our categories in, then we'll continue moving down the list here. Is your podcast going to contain explicit content? If so, make sure you check this box. If you don't check it and it turns out you use inappropriate language or something and Apple catches on, they can pull your podcast off of Apple, which would not be a good thing. Next, you get to choose whether or not you want your podcast to be episodic or serial. My podcast is set up as episodic, which means I just continue to add more episodes. It's not series-based or season-based. If you're planning to have a podcast where you have dedicated seasons to a specific topic or something, that is when you would want to click serial. For the sake of this demo, we're going to leave it as episodic. If you have a website dedicated for your podcast, this is where you put your podcast URL. Here you can actually choose how many episodes you want to be shown at any given time. I would recommend showing all of the episodes. That way, if someone comes 3 years from now and finds your podcast episodes, they can actually listen to the old episodes as well. Once we get to the keyword section, this is a very important section. Similar to what we had discussed with the description using keywords that are specific to your topic and niche, here we can select a maximum of 12 keywords. So we want to be very careful when we select these keywords to make sure that they are relevant and pertain to our audience and the content that we are sharing. For the sake of this example, I use pretty similar keywords to what I've used on the 9-5 podcast. You'll just want to make sure that you use up all 12 keyword spots. Now that we have the basic podcast information done, now we can actually upload the podcast episode itself. So we will come back over here to our episodes, and we are going to click upload a new episode. Here you can either drag and drop your file or choose a file to upload. And we're going to grab test 2 here. Now this is where you give your podcast episode a title, and you will add a description of the podcast. Just like your podcast show description, your episode descriptions are very important. We want to make sure that we use keywords that are related to the podcast episode, but are also attention grabbing so that the viewer who reads that description will be enticed to click. Once our description is done, we choose if we want to use the same artwork that we've already uploaded or if we want to upload new artwork for the specific episode. One thing that Buzzsprout does is they do allow you, if you wanted a new artwork for every episode, you could upload something different every single time. I have seen several artists and podcasters do this. I tend to leave it just as my main podcast artwork, but really the choice is up to you. Now, once we have chosen our artwork, we'll get to determine if our podcast is season-based, what season it is, and then what episode it is in that season, or if it's just episodic, then we just choose which episode this podcast is going to be. Then you have the option to choose whether your episode is going to be a full episode, a trailer, or a bonus. This will be a full episode, and we are going to say it does contain explicit material. Now we scroll down, got the artist and guest. I am the artist. For the summary, this is another section very similar to this. Some podcast apps will actually read off of the podcast description. Some will read off the podcast summary. So you want to make sure that this summary is also very keyword specific and related to the podcast episode. This custom web page, if you have show notes for your podcast like I do, this is where you'll actually put in the URL for those show notes pages. Finally, we'll add tags for this specific podcast episode. I don't think there is a limit as to the number of tags you can add. I will usually add something between 10 and 12, very similar to what we did when we picked the keywords for our podcast episode. So I'll come in here and add in relevant keywords to this episode. And once I'm done, then we can choose if we want to publish this episode immediately or schedule for the future. One thing to keep in mind, before you can get your podcasts into the directories, you have to have an episode live. Yes, that means your launch date is not going to be your true launch date, but not many people are going to be able to find your podcast in Buzzsprout until it's pushed to the different directories. So as long as you don't tell anybody that your podcast is live yet, you really don't have to worry about ruining that launch. In order for us to start pushing this podcast out to the directories, we're going to start by making this first episode live immediately. So rather than schedule for the future, we're going to click publish immediately, and then we're going to save episode details. Now that your podcast is saved and live, now we can start reaching out to the various directories like Apple and Spotify and Google so that we can get your podcast out on those directories. So we will come up to the top here where it says directories. Okay, once we're here for the directories and you can see all the different directories that we can get our podcast listed to, one thing to keep in mind is your RSS feed number. So I'm not going to be using this podcast. I'm going to delete it later. So this is my RSS feed number for this specific podcast called Nick's Podcast. This is the URL that you'll need to put in to these various directories to help them find your podcast. So we copy that and we'll come back in here and we will click first, let's do Spotify. And here we'll give you kind of a review of all the information to make sure that all your podcast information is in there. So you're going to review your podcast info that we set up at the beginning in the settings. You're going to make sure that we have at least one live episode like we just discussed. We're going to have a description for your podcast, artwork for your podcast. You have the category selected, your language selected. If your podcast is going to contain explicit material, make sure that checkbox is checked as well. Once we have all of this information, now we can actually submit the podcast to Spotify. And we'll come through and we'll do the same thing for all of these. One thing I did want to mention, getting your podcast into these directories will take a little bit of time. I think iTunes specifically says it can take up to 2 weeks. When I submitted for my podcast to get the 9.5 podcast onto iTunes, I think it took about 3 or 4 days to get my podcast into Apple. So that's just something to think about and keep in mind when you are getting ready to launch the podcast. But the good news is once your podcast is in those directories, the companies themselves actually continue to scan and look for more episodes from your podcast. So once it's in the directories, you're done. And it is that simple, guys. Your podcast is now ready to get pushed out into the world. If you have any questions as you're getting started with your podcast journey, or if you need help getting your podcast into Buzzsprout or into the various directories, shoot me a message down in the comments below and I'd be more than happy to help. Thank you for tuning into the How to Start a Podcast video series. In the series, we cover the equipment and software that you need to get started, how to actually record your episodes and edit those episodes, and then how to get those episodes uploaded and pushed out into the world. If you've enjoyed this video or if you've watched any other videos in this series and you have enjoyed them, please hit that subscribe button and like this video. You can find all the links discussed in this video in the description down below, and that includes a link to Buzzsprout. Now, just as a little disclaimer, I am an affiliate for Buzzsprout, so if you use my link for Buzzsprout, I will get a small commission for that, but it comes at no additional charge to you. So you can choose if you want to use the affiliate link or not. I will leave that up to you. Now, I hope you enjoyed this podcast series. If you need any help as you start your podcast journey, don't hesitate to reach out. You can either leave a comment down below or come over on Twitter. That is where I'm most active.